Hey everybody. I haven't done a video in a while, so I thought I would take the opportunity to just come on today and go through sort of an overview of some creators that have been very impactful, very influential on me over the years, and talk a little bit about who they are and why and what they've done. And I'll do maybe half of them on this video, and then we'll come back and do the other half. So I'm thinking about 16 that it seemed like the 16 most obvious ones. And they're not always the most popular or the biggest names necessarily. For example, some people might list a George Lucas. Well, sure, I love Star Wars, but that there's not much I can say about George Lucas that hasn't been said a million times, and there's nothing about Star Wars influencing me that isn't, I think, very obvious on the surface and hasn't been replicated by other other properties in some ways over the many years. So I'm focusing on the ones that are more personal to me, really. I mean, some of them are very popular and big for sure, but they impacted me in a more personal way. As far as how they influenced my work and just how much they entertained me and how much I enjoyed them. So I don't have a set, I've got 16 set, but I don't have a set number of what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to do 8 and then we'll stop. And I'm going to go kind of randomly. So I'm looking at my list here. Let's see. I think we'll start out with the most obvious one to those that know anything about me. I'm going to mark them off here when I do them. And that would be, if you're watching on the video version of this, Roger Zelazny, right? Obviously. Now, I've talked, at length in other places about these books and about this author, the single most influential creator ever on me. The way that he writes, the way he puts words together, sentences together, phrases together, paragraphs together, paragraphs that take an entire couple of pages. He did that once. I don't want to sound like that's what he does all the time. There's other times that paragraphs are one sentence over and over and over, or a piece of dialogue over and over. But Zelazny will always be, probably, as far as I can imagine, my number one influence and most favorite creator. For his prose poetry of writing, for his subject matter, which is focused often on immortality, themes of immortality, the smart aleck hero protagonist that has a hidden agenda or has who is an unreliable narrator, the use of first person quite often, and just the experimentalness. I mean, I just love the fact that Zelazny rarely wrote the same approach to a story twice. Now, in fact, that may be why some Zelazny purists don't love the Amber books that much, because the Amber books, the first book maybe, was experimental. That was different than anything he had probably done before. But by the time you get to the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, all the way up to the 10th, it's become a franchise doing pretty much following the same formula more or less over and over, rather than being, innovative. So some of the things that readers love about Zelazny, you lose later in the Amber series because he really has stopped innovating to a certain degree, and he's just giving you more of that one thing he did that time that you liked. And that's great with a lot of us, because I like having more of that thing that he did that I liked. Heck yeah. But, there's other books he wrote like where he did completely different things. Like Crossroads, I believe, is the one where there's only chapters called chapter 1 and chapters called chapter 2. And he then, he wrote each one and then sealed them each in envelopes and shuffled the envelopes up, and they printed the book in the order he randomly drew them out. If you can make a book work when it's written that way, that's impressive, right? Everything he did, just about, aside from the subsequent Amber sequels, was written using a different style and a different approach. So I was trying to think of something original that I hadn't said about Zelazny before to lead off with here, since that book was sitting on the top of my pile. But I think that's pretty much it, is that there's so much to admire, but there's also so much diversity And so I guess the Amber books suffer a little bit for lacking that diversity, but he makes up for it, I think, with incredibly imaginative characters and situations and dialogue and everything else. So, all right. We'll put Roger out of the way. And by the way, I still haven't done the 31 Days of October with A Night in the Lonesome October. I couldn't find a copy of it this year. It's like the one Zelazny book that I don't own, and I did not have a copy of it. So that's, if you don't know, that's where people read one chapter. There's 31 chapters in that book, and you read one chapter a night during the month of October leading up to Halloween, right? So I'm going to do that eventually. I just didn't get to do it this year. Next up, let's look at the book I'm currently reading, which is a good example. It's got dust on it from being out here in my studio. A good example of what this author can do, and that's Michael Connelly. Now, that's quite a jump, isn't it? That's quite a transition from Roger Zelazny to Michael Connelly. But let's face it, quality is quality, right? Good stuff is good stuff, regardless of the genre, regardless of when it was written or whatever. Good stuff is good stuff. And Connelly is one of those people that I think, and you want to see what it looks like, there he is on the back. The day is coming when I have the chutzpah to do one of my book covers that way. But not yet. Not yet. But I like the trade dress they're using on these now. But the thing about Connelly, he's one of these guys that I would refer to as deceptively complex and skilled, meaning that he's so skilled at laying out the characters, laying out the dialogue, laying out the narrative, that you think, that wasn't that hard to write. Anybody could do that. And then you think about it and you realize how all the pieces are constructed, how he's put it all together, how he's layered it all and connected everything. And you realize, man, that thing seems simple on the surface, but it's extremely complex. I've always said that about, for example, Jimmy Page's guitar work. You can listen to Led Zeppelin and you can hear Jimmy Page's like in your face, down, 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 down. And I can play that, and I can't hardly play the guitar. I've not played the guitar. I've played the guitar badly since high school, and I can do that. But then you listen beneath the surface, and it's just like, oh my goodness. And Connelly is one of those guys, right? That is able to. Let me check him off my list. He's one of those guys that makes it look easy, is what I'm trying to say, right? He makes it look easy. I love also, and this is something I'll mention right here. I haven't mentioned really much before. I love that he's big on this whole meta thing. Let me explain what I mean. I like it a lot. I really enjoy it when an author does literary tricks, sleight of hand, or puts in little Easter eggs, so to speak. One of the most famous ones, in fact, is in Zelazny's Lord of Light, where he spends half the book setting up this incredibly terrible pun, which I won't spoil. But if you read Lord of Light, have your seatbelt buckled for when that pun hits you, because it might give you whiplash. We talked about it on the podcast about at DragonCon this year, the panel. So you can go back and listen if you want to get the details of it to the DragonCon 2017 Zelazny panel a couple of episodes ago on White Rocket. But there are authors that do tricks like that make you go, whoa, right? It takes you out of the story, but in a good way. It's like you stop for a second and kind of have a laugh or kind of have a revelation or kind of go, whoa. And it does take you out of the story, but in a way that's positive, not negative, I don't have him on my list, but Gene Wolfe, who wrote, and let's see if I don't want to turn the back on the camera too much, but somewhere back here is the Gene Wolfe, the books. In fact, I may have gotten rid of that series that I'm referred to now, but he wrote a series called the Book of the Long Sun. I mean, he's most famous for the Book of the New Sun, which is the book about the torturer. But But the sort of sequel series, 4 books to that, was called The Book of the Long Sun, which started with Nightside the Long Sun. And in those books, the whole thing is written, you think, in first person. And you go through multiple volumes of this series thinking you're reading a first person narrative, like, which would mean like, I did this, I went here, I said this, he said this back to me, she said this back to me, he and she did this, and I did that, right? That's a first person narrative. A third person narrative would be entirely, he went over there, he walked over here, he did this, he looked at her, she said this, right? That's third person. Second person barely exists at all in literature, because second person is saying, you did this, you. And that's really strange, right? I mean, who wants to read a whole book of you did this and you did that? Because A, it sounds weird and it's awkward, and B, it would be telling you something that you theoretically would already know because you did it, right? Like, it's like if I wrote a book saying, you watched this video, and you're watching this video going, well, yeah, I know. So second person is kind of weird. But here's what Gene Wolfe did in one of those Long Sun books that absolutely made me put the book down for a minute and go, whoa. What he did was, partway through one of the volumes, he said he has the main character who's writing in first person, I. The first person says, and you. And you that's one of those things where you get whiplash, right? You go, this whole thing has been in second person all along, and we didn't find it out until like the third book of the 4 books, because he's talking to you, the reader, who is one of the characters, but you don't know he's talking to you, one of the characters, until that far into the story. Up until then, it's been me, I, and they. So I loved that. And I did something somewhat similar in one of my books that came out in the last 3 years. And I was very excited when the opportunity arose, when it occurred to me, right? I'm writing away, and I thought, oh, I can do the Gene Wolfe second person trick here, and it will be awesome. And it was. So that's the little trick there. And Connolly does that in the Bosch books and in the Lincoln Lawyer books. Although with those, it's not so much a trick as just the Bosch books and the Lincoln Lawyer books, they happen in real time in the real world. So like this new one that just came out, this book happens in 2017. And so what that means is, and it's in the real world theoretically. So what that means is that the Bosch TV show is on television in those books. The Lincoln Lawyer movie with Matthew McConaughey happened in those books. People look at Bosch and go, hey, that's the guy the TV show's based on in the books. Or, not exactly, but that's the kind of thing that could happen. And so whenever he just like maybe once or twice, moving on, number 3, which we'll go with Jim Starlin. Okay, I'm gonna make Jim Starlin. We've done a short story and novelist guy, and we've done a crime novelist, and now we'll do a primarily a comics writer. And I just grabbed a Jim Starlin book I happen to have handy, and that would be Infinity Watch with Adam Warlock. But this is just one of a bunch of really good things that Starlin has done over the years. I mean, he's most famous probably today for creating Thanos, the villain of the main villain in the back of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I'll pass this on to you for those who haven't heard. Starlin was invited to the set where they're filming the 2 new Avengers movies that are coming out in 2018 and 2019. And those are the ones that are going to kind of, to a certain degree, wrap up the main thrust of the current iteration of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There'll be others scattered around, but those are the two, heavyweights. And Starlin went to the set, and he created Thanos. He's very proprietary about Thanos, and he said he was pretty darned excited and happy and satisfied with how they're using Thanos in those movies. And I say, if Jim Starlin is happy with it, then I certainly am happy with it. So, but Starlin, the thing that I love about Starlin and his work that's very influential is the whole cosmic angle, the whole idea of cosmic gods. There's a lot of Zelazny type influences. I don't know if it's. Let me rephrase that. There's a lot of elements to Jim Starlin that you also find in a different way in Zelazny and vice versa. And by that I mean powerful, godlike, immortal beings that make grim pronouncements in flowery language, right? I mean, they both have that in spades. Starlin is more like the Jack Kirby style of big, colorful, over the top, whereas Zelazny would be more, it's to a certain degree it's over the top, but it's just barely over the top. Starlin's stuff pole vaults over the top of wackiness, but still, I mean, all the great stories that Starlin has done with the Silver Surfer, with Adam Warlock, with Thanos, with the Avengers, even with Spider-Man and Ben Grimm, The Thing. My all-time favorite comic book story ever is Avengers Annual Number 7, which is continued in Marvel 2-1 Annual Number 2, which is where Thanos is going to blow up every star in the galaxy or something to try to impress Death, because he's in love with this Lady Death figure. It's not Lady Death the character, but it's Death, who is kind of a lady in the Marvel Universe in a hood and robes. He's in love with her, and he's trying to impress her. And Warlock, Captain Marvel, the Avengers, and so on have to come to the rescue and defeat Thanos. So, that's my favorite comic story ever, because the way it's written, and not even to mention Starlin's artwork, but just his writing, the style, the way that he conveys big cosmic giant ideas. It's powerful, it's inspiring, it leaves you in awe. And there's some characters that only Starlin can write. I would argue that Thanos, Warlock, I think that other writers have done okay with Marvel, but those two in particular, I mean, Starlin is the only one that really understands them, I think. While we're talking about comics, I did do a video on this guy a while back, but I'll mention him here because I really have to, and that's Christopher Muller's Iron Empires, Faith Conquers, Shiva's War. There's a new one. I have it upstairs in hardcover. I can't think what it's called. But Muller is a painter, and that's all the more galling to me that he's a painter primarily, because he's also a writer, and these are just so incredibly well written. They're brilliant. They are like a pulp version of Dune, which some of my work has been compared to, by the way, a pulp version of Dune, but that's fine. These were very influential on me, particularly when I was writing the scripts for the 3-issue Cold Lightning comic. I kept thinking to myself, if I can write 3 issues of a comic that are anywhere close to as well written, as powerful, as engaging as this stuff, then I'm doing very, very well indeed, and can't complain. Because it's just the narrative flow, the transitions. I mean, the hardest thing to me about writing comic book scripts, it's not hard in the sense of I can't do it. I mean, it's the most challenging, right? It's the thing that you have to work the most on to get it just right. And I certainly feel like I did. But page transitions, scene transitions, dialogue. You have to be economical in the sense that you in a novel you can just throw out word salad and hope that it all shakes out and makes sense. But in a comic book format, in a graphic novel format, you can't really, you have to be very sparse in how many words you use and how verbose you are. Really, the fewer the better to a certain degree. It's been, back in the 60s, Stan Lee would throw half of a novel's worth of words into a comic book story. The panels would be small and they'd have all these words in them. And over time, we've gone completely from that all the way to like the whole splash pages with almost no words at all, just action, one big scene. And I think there's a happy medium, right? I don't like either one of those. I don't want to feel like I'm reading a novel when I'm reading a comic. A comic book shouldn't explain everything you're seeing in the text. On the other hand, a comic book shouldn't leave everything visual and descriptive up to the artist, because what if the artist doesn't depict something in a proper way? There's nothing to fall back on, right? Let me give you kind of a made-up example of the difference between these two things, okay? In an old early 60s like Stan Lee comic, you might have like Mr. Fantastic is flying the Fantastic car to help the Thing who's fighting a monster. And in the little tiny panel, the caption would have said, Mr. Fantastic jumps into the Fantastic car to go help the Thing. And then there would be like a word balloon or a thought balloon in the same panel saying, I have to go help the Thing. Just showing the picture more often than not should be enough. You don't need the caption and the dialogue all reinforcing the same thing. Now, like I say, occasionally, you don't want, because I've read comics, particularly the ones written by a certain comics writer who will be named nameless, Bendis, Brian Michael Bendis, where there's not enough descriptive text or dialogue for you to understand what's happening in the scene without the artist totally, pulling it off. And if the artist leaves anything the least bit obscure, then you're left with scenes where you go, I don't understand what just happened, right? There was, say what you will about Stan putting way too many words into a page and into a panel, but there was never really a moment in those old 60s comics where you didn't know exactly what was happening on the page. And I can think of many, many moments in modern comics where I've been following along in a story, and all of a sudden they will depend entirely on the artist to convey what's happening, and I don't know what's going on. And there's no help. There's no clues. There's no cues, right? There's nothing in words that can tell me what I'm seeing here. So learning how to find that happy medium where you have enough words on the page to anchor the art and to make the art work better and serve the story, but not so many words that it obscures the art and becomes just a stew of words, So, and Moeller is particularly good at that, and I tried to learn a lot of lessons from him in how to do it properly. And when Cold Lightning finally comes out, hopefully in a few weeks or months, it's on the fast track now, then you can judge for yourself. Okay, we're halfway through this one. Let me see what else I can talk about is on my list. I've gone through 4 things now. Oh, I know, back here, right behind me. Right back here behind me is Vernor Vinge's A Fire Upon the Deep. Okay, and A Fire Upon the Deep is one of the best science fiction novels. I'm just going to put it back so it doesn't get lost. It's a Hugo winner. It's one of the best science fiction novels I've ever read. And I'm including it on this list because while I'm not a huge fan of Vinge's writing overall, there are other books he's written that I haven't liked nearly as much. I really like that book for one reason, because it's an excellent example of world building in a science fiction and a space opera setting. World building. And what I mean is not just, when people say world building, you might think, oh, like he describes a planet. No, that's not what I mean at all. I mean like the whole universe. Well, in this case, the galaxy. In A Fire Upon the Deep, Vinge lays out the idea that our galaxy is made up of sort of concentric rings, like a bullseye, right? A target. Concentric rings, what he calls zones of thought. But what they really are is levels of speed and energy and stuff. I borrowed a lot of ideas from this, and this was very influential into how I laid out the above universe. We have in my books, you have the above, you have the below, and you have that middle area where we are. Like, we exist in the middle, and there's the above where the gods are, and there's the below where the demons are. So what I'm doing is kind of combining the heaven and hell with the earth as the middle kingdom idea with the zones of thought idea. What Varley means in the zones of thought is that, and by the way, there's more to mine. I mean, that's the very basic, is the above, the below, and the in-between. There's different layers of each that have different things that happen, and there's different speeds and different energy and all that too. So I've worked all that out. I'm just saying in general terms. But in A Fire Upon the Deep, the thing about the zones of thought is, the closer you get toward the center of the galaxy, I guess because the stars are so much closer together and they're so much more dense and there's so much more gravity warping going on there because of all those stars close together and maybe black holes or one big black hole. Because of all that, the closer you travel toward the middle of the galaxy, the more technology breaks down. So and travel. So in Venji's galaxy, the zones of thought, if you're closer to the galactic core, starships cannot travel faster than light, and computers can't be much better than like a calculator. But the further you go out, and there are specifically delineated zones, okay? The further you go out, now suddenly spaceships can travel a little faster than light, and you can have, good computers. Go a little further out, and now spaceships can travel much faster than light, and you can have basically sentient thinking machines, right? And when you get all the way outside the galaxy, you basically have gods, because they are, like artificial intelligence entities that have gone out there, and there's no more physical limitation on the speed of their thinking and their electrical impulses traveling, and so they can just like think so quickly that they've evolved into godlike beings. I just love that. I think that's a fantastic idea. That I've certainly borrowed plenty from. So I recommend Vernor Vinge and A Fire Upon the Deep. Let's see. What else do we want to do? Let's do Dan Abnett. Okay. So we've done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is number 6. Dan Abnett. I'm going to grab one of my Dan Abnett. Let's get Ravener. Yeah. Ravener. Abnett is a fantastic writer. Fantastic. My only complaint is that he hasn't written much in the Warhammer 40,000 or in the Horus Heresy universe in quite a while. But Abnett is my favorite writer for doing stuff like this, which is this far future, gothic military universe where, Warhammer, the Emperor of Mankind, is an immortal telepathic being, like if the mule from Foundation was Emperor. Protecting us from the evil things that go bump in the night or in another dimension. I do wish that Dan would. I assume what's happened is it's probably one of two things. He was having some health problems for a while. He also was co-creator of the current Guardians of the Galaxy, so he's got something going on with that. He wrote a Guardians of the Galaxy book that coincided with the movie coming out. But he also has been working on for some other companies and doing some other things. But sadly enough, that means that the Black Library and Warhammer, they are missing his talents now. And there are other writers that they have that are quite good, and certainly I'm going to mention Graham McNeil coming up in the future. He's on my list too. but he hasn't done much for them either lately, and so they're down to sort of their B team. I do realize that Aaron Dembski Bowden is very widely, very highly regarded, but I'm not a huge fan of the darker part of that universe. And Bowden, Aaron Dembski Bowden is very adept at telling the stories of the bad guys, the dark side, and that's not my favorite thing. So, not reading those three, not being able, if Abnett and Graham McNeil are not producing anymore, at least right now, and I don't really enjoy Aaron Dembski Bowden that much, that leaves you with kind of the B and C team. They're still good writers, but they don't excite me the way that those guys do, and so it's disappointing. But the thing about Abnett is Abnett can write like the old-time pulp writers. He really gets it. And I find that unusual in modern British writers, because it seems to me that British authors nowadays are very long-winded. British writers nowadays, and maybe for a long time, but certainly the ones I read these days, last 20 years or so, they love to type, write. And they don't like to be terse. They don't like to do quick action scenes. They like to go on and on and on and have, footnotes and explanations and just all this stuff. Abnett writes like an old school American pulp writer, but with a definite British flavor to it. And that's a very unusual and unique thing, and it's one of the reasons that I think so highly of him. One of several. The other, he's just a good craftsman. He writes good characters and good stories and writes them in a very engaging way. So I have a lot of respect for Dan Abnett. I consider him one of my three main influences, along with Zelazny and Jim Starlin. That's very high praise from me to put him in the top three. For the last two more. I'm going to go with James Clavell. James Clavell, the author of the Asian Saga, which is kind of retroactively called that. It was just some books he wrote about Asia. Let me bring you up one here. Here's the classic design. Right, those white books that they're kind of modeled on the Japanese flag because they came out in support of Shogun when it was a TV miniseries, and it was done up with the white with the red like the Japanese flag. Of course, that doesn't really work for most of the rest because Shogun is the only one set in Japan. This one is set in Iran during the Iranian Revolution of 1979, and most of the others are set in China. But in fact, here's the more modern trade dress for Shogun, for example. What an amazing book! And by the way, I just picked up Shogun and Taipan on Audible for like $7.50 a piece. That's a great deal. So they're like 55 hours each. Those are wonderful books. What the strengths of Clavell and how he's impacting to me. Amazing, deep characters. Incredible. The sense he has for Hong Kong and China and Japan and Singapore and all the places he writes about. He seems to know those places in and out. He knows the people in and out. He knows their customs and their culture in and out. I learned so much reading those books, right? Just absorbing, like if science fiction went into the depth of their backgrounds the way Clavell does with Asia, it would be astonishing. In fact, the only thing I can think of where they go into the background that deep in a fictional way would be Lord of the Rings. In a way, the Asian Saga is like the Lord of the Rings of finance and trade in Asia. I know that sounds bizarre, but it's awesome because these China traders like Dirk Struan are action heroes all the way. They are pulp action heroes. they should really make. I mean, I know they made a movie out of Taipan with Brian Brown that was not very well done. They tried to cram a giant story into like 2 hours. It needed to be like Shogun, a miniseries, and stretched out over a long period of time. So I don't understand why they did it that way, but yeah, I mean, James Clavell, absolute craftsman writing those books. Shogun is probably the best. The thing of it is, Shogun is probably the best crafted book of all those books, but it has the least to do with the saga. It has the least to do with the series. The one that probably has the most to do, or the two that have the most to do with the saga, the series and everything, are Taipan and Noble House. Noble House is the Rosetta Stone of the entire series. It's a long book. I was thinking about showing you a copy, but I only have the 2 hard covers of it. I've got 3 copies of Whirlwind down there. That's weird. But I'll bring up one of the volumes to show you. Noble House, this is half of the book. They split it into 2 because it's so long. But Noble House is an incredible story of 1963 Hong Kong. It's basically the week before JFK was shot, if I recall correctly. It never really touches on that at all, but it leads up toward that, which is interesting. And it's the reason I say it's the Rosetta Stone of the Clavell Asian Saga is because just about every other book and all the major characters and some minor characters in all the other books get referenced or connected in Noble House. You know, you find out stuff that happens in the other books. You find out why and how and what became of them and all that in Noble House because it happens more recently than the others. In fact, I guess the only Clavell book that happens more recently than Noble House is Whirlwind. And the reason I was so wishing that he had lived long enough to write one more book is he was working his way, you know, to some degree it seemed like he was working his way toward the present day, and we would find out what happened with all this. But, you know, unfortunately, the last book he wrote, Gaijin, goes all the way back to the late 1800s in Japan. So it was a good one, too, I thought. I mean, I know some people don't like it. But Noble House got us up to the 60s. Whirlwind touched on some things from the end of Noble House because Whirlwind happens in 79. And what I really, really wanted was a book set maybe during the fall of the Soviet Union and the coming down of the Berlin Wall, or maybe during Tiananmen Square in 89, because then you could have maybe seen what became of those characters. You know, what became of Ian Dunross, what became of the characters from the helicopter pilots from Whirlwind, what became of the all those different characters that were introduced in Noble House and in Whirlwind and that were connected to the previous one. So that would have been nice, but unfortunately he passed away. I've done 7, so I can do one more. And let's see. I think I'll go with Robert E. Howard. Robert E. Howard is probably my favorite old school pulp writer. I've got those right here. Let's pull this out without making everything fall down would be nice. Here's the Del Rey Wandering Star edition of The Coming of Conan the Cimmerian. That's how I pronounce it, Cimmerian. I know that some say Cimmerian, which seems ridiculous to me. But these are wonderful editions, by the way. You can see them back here on my shelf, those black ones there. Because they had different artists, like, let's see, for this one, I think it's Gary Gianni, but I may be wrong. This one's Mark Schultz. Okay. They had different artists come through and fully illustrate with, like, spot illustrations all the way through, like that. And then you turn just one page or two, and you get this. See? So spot illustrations all the way through. And But anyway, it's the writing that I'm talking about, and there's a few full page too, but the writing is what I'm talking about, because Robert E. Howard was amazing at writing full-blooded, full-bore, action-packed scenes. Just amazing. As the quote from Stephen King, of all people, right? Stephen King says, Howard's writing seems so highly charged with energy that it nearly gives off sparks. It's so powerful. It's so forceful. It's right in your face. From Robert E. Howard, I learned so much about keeping things moving, being in your face with action, using descriptive words. It seems like so much of modern writing, they try to hammer the colorfulness out of us. This is one reason why I will not take a writing class. I will not be in a writing course. I will not do anything like that, because they want to homogenize and dumb down and blandify all genre writing, make it all the same. Don't name your chapters. Don't have a prologue. Don't have an epilogue. For God's sake, don't put a map or anything in the front. You wouldn't want anybody to have that to contend with. I'm being very sarcastic and facetious. But Howard uses colorful language, and by that I don't mean foul language at all. I mean, he uses vivid descriptions, opulent, just flush. I mean, maybe I should give you a little example if I could find one. I didn't prepare anything, so. Like just the start of this little section. Like stalking tigers, they crept across the darkly gleaming floor and halted outside the sparkling door. With a deft and cautious hand, Taurus tried it. It gave without resistance, and the companions looked in, tensed for anything. Over the Nemedian shoulder, Conan had a glimpse of a glittering chamber, the walls, ceiling, and floor of which were crusted with great white jewels, which lighted it brightly, and which seemed its only illumination. It seemed empty of life. See, there's way too many colorful adjectives in that paragraph for most modern writers to want to deal with. But it works. Howard works. He makes it work. And so, being able to know when and how to avoid to embellish things and break the rules is as important as knowing the rules in the first place. You don't want to overdo adjectives and adverbs. You certainly don't. But on the other hand, judiciously using them like that can lend a lot of power and vividness and full-bloodedness to your writing, and I certainly try to do that. I always try to start every story with action, with things happening, moving forward, go, go, go. You can tell how they got in this situation on the run, on the fly as you're going, but go, go, go. When somebody picks that book up, they don't want to have to slog through 2 or 3 pages of nothing but descriptions and talking. They want to pick that thing up and be transported. Boom, 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 go. So that's a big influence that Robert E. Howard certainly has had on me, and I'm sure plenty of writers, is go for the throat right out of the gate, right off the starting line. Don't mess around. Go for it. So, all right. Well, that's 8. I talked about Roger Zelazny, James Clavell, Vernor Vinge, Dan Abnett, Robert E. Howard, Jim Starlin, Michael Connelly, and Christopher Moeller. All right, guys and gals. So hopefully you found something interesting in all that. Next time, we're going to look at the other 8, and I'll go ahead and tell you who the other 8 are. In, again, no particular order. The other 8 are Larry Niven, John Varley, Patrick O'Brien, Frank Herbert, Graham McNeil, Jack Kirby, Joe Straczynski, and Donald Westlake. These are like the 16 people who are in my writing DNA, in my creative DNA. And I'm trying to tell you why you should care and why they matter and why they're in there. So that was 8. We'll do 8 more next time. I guess I'll wrap up for now and see you guys later. And hope you found this interesting. We'll see you guys down the road. Hey, don't forget, if you're watching this on the video, you're probably seeing it maybe on Patreon. If not, Patreon.com, Patreon. I'll probably try to put a link in the YouTube text down there. Help us out. White Rocket needs your help to stay on the air. So patreon.com/Van Allen Plexico, or just go to Patreon and type in Plexico in the search box, and I should pop right up. As little as $1 a month helps us stay on the air, keep doing videos like this, keep doing audio, and keep getting out to the masses with more and more cool stuff. And I also welcome your suggestions from patrons. So let me know if you're already a patron what you'd like me to talk about, or have somebody on as a guest, or John and I talk about, or Jared and I talk about. So, all right, we're going to wrap up, and I'll see you guys with the next part 2 coming up down the road.